An Old Testament scholar gave a guest lecture to a group of students on the Song of Songs. The scholar specialized in ancient Eastern love poetry. He wasn't some creepy old guy who gets off on ancient erotic fiction. He was an authority of the Song of Songs, and he interpreted the biblical song in light of the other ancient love poems, as should be. There was a feeling of tension in the classroom as he went into detail about the real meaning of the poem. His body is polished ivory, says the English Standard Version, but according to the scholar, the Hebrew word for body refers to the man's midsection, and the image of ivory is intended to invoke the original form of ivory, an elephant's tusk. So the wife in the Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 14, is admiring her well-hung husband. The reaction amongst the students was classic. Blushes, giggles, and eyebrows raised to the ceiling. Apparently, their Sunday school teachers never explained the connection between an ivory tusk and a penis. If that's what the Bible says, then why don't our translation say what the Bible says? Translations are filtered through a bit of political correctness. I spend a good deal instilling in my followers a passion to interpret and believe what the Bible actually says, not what we want it to say. A lot of religious people have been covering up obscene language in the Bible for years. Jewish scribes in the Middle Ages who copied the Hebrew Old Testament used as the base for all English translation edited out some vulgar words and replaced them with nicer ones. For instance, God originally prophesied through Zechariah that women in Israel would be raped by wicked invading armies. The word God inspired is shagel, and according to the Hebrew linguist, shagel is an obscene word described as a sexual act. And it's not where we get the British word shag. But whenever God said shagel, Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 30 and Isaiah chapter 13 verse 16, the Masorite scribes replaced them with a more tame shakef, to lie with. And all of our literal English translations agree that the word from the Middle Ages is better than the one spoken by the Creator. The Bible is full of obscene languages. Ezekiel talks about huge penises, female genital fluid produced at sexual arousal, and large quantities of semen being poured out on Israel. Instead of grounding the prophet, modern translators edit out the vulgarity so that Ezekiel can be read about in church. The Apostle Paul was so enraptured by the scandalous grace of God that he came dangerously close to cussing. I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as scubula, in order that I may gain Christ. Philippians chapter 3, verse 8. The Greek word scubula is more vulgar than crap, but not quite as harsh as shit. Either way, most translations dim it down by using words like rubbish, which means trash, not excrement or dung, which is more accurate but far less offensive. In some ways, it's understandable that we don't want to be using this type of language in church. But on the other hand, the gospel is offensive. Grace is scandalous, and that's the real point. The biblical prophets sometimes use offensive language, but not to produce shock for its own sake. Edginess was never the goal, and neither was some vague notion of Christian freedom. God's messengers use vulgar image to shock their religious audience out of complacency, because sometimes the goodness of God becomes lost in the fall of Christianese rhetoric and religious routine. And the only way to wake us up is to use provocative language. So how do we reconcile Ezekiel's filthy tongue with Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29? Let no corruption talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fit the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Does this outlaw all forms of vulgarity? Not exactly. The word for corrupting, sapros, literally means rotten, decaying, or unwholesome. The whole point is not to forbid certain words that are labeled cuss words by its culture, but all speech that does not build up. If modern day preachers cuss or use vulgar terms only to get a rise out of conservative, they aren't being prophetic, they're simply immature. Similarly, if you call someone a piece of scubula or blurt out shagel after stubbing your toe, you're not being prophetic or biblical, just undisciplined. But if your gospel presentation is putting your moralistic crowd to sleep, or if your Pharisaic friend is more concerned about proper speech than an addiction to grace, then you may need to tell him that his Christless church attendance is nothing more than a bloody tampon until he clings to the cross, as Isaiah did in chapter 64, verse 6. I'm Reverend said. Please join me for daily prayer, Bible study, and spiritual inspiration. And until the next time, y'all stay blessed.